right. So this is going to be a very interesting century. It's going to raise all kinds of questions. So is it actually an Armenian kingdom if it's not in Armenia? Is it enough that the people who head the kingdom and the church consider themselves to be scions or offshoots of the original Armenian leadership? What about if those people are only partly Armenian in terms of ethnicity, as we would now consider it? What if Armenian is not necessarily the language of the kingdom? You know, you're pushing the boundaries now. When you think of modern Armenians and what they believe their identity rests on, you're starting to fool with the major pillars of the identity. And how are people going to feel about all of this? And what are they actually thinking about as they come towards being the third and the fourth generation to live outside of the Armenian homeland? For them, what is Armenianness? For them, what is Armenian Christianity? And so for some people who live, some Armenians who live in the Cilician area, what they feel mostly is a nostalgia for the past. Especially because the past, as it recedes, takes on more of a glow about it. It becomes more perfect. It becomes more mythologized in a way. So it contrasts beautifully with one's day-to-day difficulties. And so it's easy, it's an option, certainly, to live in that past. What about other people who decide, okay, the past is the past, it's gone. Let's make the most we can make out of the opportunities of this new region, out of the various alignments that are possible with that region's non-Armenian populations. That's the way that we should go. So there are people who want to look back. There are people who want to look at what's in their immediate vicinity. Meanwhile, in the northern area that was the Armenian homeland, there's a strong need to preserve themselves, whatever that means to them, we'll talk about that later, in the face of an overwhelming Islamic presence. How are they going to preserve a common denominator of faith, culture, and ethics when the Armenian population in what was the homeland is now split between multiple Islamic entities? So in other words, you can't even go from one area of what used to be Armenia to another without a passport. And that idea of we must remain different, we must maintain our culture and our faith, is going to be a very strong motivation in the choices people in those areas make about how to live under the domination of another religion. It also is going to make them quite wary of Armenians like the ones in Cilicia, many of whom are going to make compromises with their surrounding, mostly Christian cultures, and who chose, in the view of their compatriots in the homeland, who chose not to return to the ancient territories, but to remain in the south. And this seems like a more clear-cut question, because nobody argues that Cilicia, this area at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, was ever part of the traditional Armenian homeland. It just was not. However, there are some things they have in common, the old and the new. Just as the Armenian homeland had always been located at a crossroads point between the Byzantine Empire to the west and the worlds of deeper Asia, as those changed over time to the east, Cilician Armenia was also a crossroad in slightly different directions. but it channeled a huge amount and a huge variety of trade. And it was a key point of travel for anyone going beyond the east end of the Mediterranean Sea. The extraordinary ports of Cilicia brought in Europeans, Africans. It was the kind of jumping off place of overland routes from Byzantium, from China, India, other parts of Asia. Trade was Cilicia's main form of wealth, although in the early stages it was not in Armenian control, but that was the quality of the area, was to be extremely diverse. If you're going to be dealing with merchant houses from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds, it behooves you to be multilingual. It behooves you to be aware of their customs. And sooner or later, there's going to be intermarriage between those populations and the locals. And so the mixture of genetics and ideas in Cilicia is going to eventually produce Armenians who are very different physically, very different culturally, very different mentally, very different linguistically, even culinarily different from those in the homeland. So over time, there's going to be maybe a rift is too small, but too big a word for it, but maybe not. There's going to be a misunderstanding or a failure to account properly for each other's situations that's going to afflict the relationship between Armenians in the homeland and Armenians in what's now the diaspora. So this is a very interesting time period. It's very interesting because as parents begin to realize that their children and grandchildren are very unlikely ever to repatriate to the Turkish principalities who have such a strong hold on the Armenian homeland, serious issues come up. Some of these are new, as you will see, they are not yet dead. This one is a serious question. It's a serious question today. What's the connection between Armenian soil and Armenianness? Is there one? And if so, what is it? This is a question that's still with us today, as Armenians everywhere, pretty much of every persuasion, no matter where their roots are going to tell you that the present Republic of Armenia is the Armenian homeland. Okay. On what grounds? When you have Armenians whose homeland is in Anatolia, or you have Armenians whose homeland is farther to the west, how is this the case? I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying it's really interesting to explore the mechanisms that hold people who have actually got no connection to Armenia in terms of their background to Armenia. And in this time period, this begins to be a serious issue. Is it enough to love Armenia? Because in this time period, going there is almost out of the question. Or do you actually have to be there? Is there a kind of mystical benefit to being present on Armenian soil? That's going to become a lively question in this time period. Can someone who has Armenian roots, even if they go back to the Arshaguni kings, can somebody with Armenian roots who has never set foot in the Armenian homeland be a real Armenian? I don't know if Eritreans have this kind of an issue. But Armenians for sure do. It's a very lively and intriguing question. Then there's this question, it's related. How much of the distant past do we need to import into the present and then from there into the future? In other words, what is our identity based on? Is it based on who we are now, or is it based on who we once were? Again, there's no easy answer to this question, and people are going to come up with different solutions to it. And a complicating factor is, okay, say that we say the past is very important, but we don't have an accurate understanding of the past. Is it enough to feel a connection to the past? So, for example, as you study more and more, you realize that the basic stories of Armenian identity that are taught to children in Sunday school here have almost no connection with factual reality, but they're nonetheless very potent in teaching children how they should be. So, for example, the story of Mashtotz's discovery of the alphabet, you're going to hear the full-blown story of how it was written in letters of fire on the walls of a cave, something which has no connection with reality. Is that sufficient, or do you need an actual real understanding of what happened? These are not easy questions. And if you do need a real understanding, where are you going to get that from? How are you going to share that? If you don't need it, then why do you bother with the real issue at all, if the other is sufficient? So, is it possible to make an identity out of the past that will be relevant and will be able to talk with, to dialogue with, to relate with the world in which we now live? How do we take the mythologies of the past, the great stories of the past, and interpret them in a way that makes sense, that does something for your life in terms of grounding it when you live in highly metropolitanized Middle East, or New York, or Detroit, or wherever we happen to be? And it's very interesting. You might sometime just have a conversation with the planning committee for St. Sarkis Church in Dallas, because they went through this whole process of how do we come up with an Armenian church that will fit in modern Texas, that will make sense in modern Texas, but that will still connect to the past. And they went through endless versions of what they wanted to build until they came up with what they finally came up with. You know, whatever one thinks of the final product, it's an interesting take on this question.
You mean as a shape, yeah, the shape of the building?
The shape of the building, the decoration of the building, the layout of the space within it's very interesting church. And the process of getting to this design took several years of going through, well, we could do this, but no, we could do this, but no. Yeah. So how do we get this to speak to the Texan Armenian population, to be understandable to the non-Armenian Texan population, and to still be Armenian? So the question comes out of this too, if we're thinking about the past and how we use it in the present, how we use it in the future, our connection between the past that we just came from and the future that we're going into. Then there's still the question about where is the future? Where is our home? Do we try to go home to the country that our parents and grandparents, maybe even ourselves, came from every year? Whenever we can, major holidays, things like that. It's a perfectly normal thing to do. For Armenians from the Anatolian and the diaspora, maybe you get to go home, in quotes, once in a lifetime, because you're not really welcome in Anatolia. So it's a big deal when somebody gets to make a pilgrimage to the place where their grandparents or great-grandparents came from. Is Armenia home for our children and grandchildren who were not born there, who may go there once a year, who didn't grow up there? How are we going to feel when it turns out not to be their home of choice? This is not a dead question. Armenian families now, you know, why do I have to go to Armenia? I'm not at home there. Is Armenia home, and should people go on a regular basis who are from Western Armenia? Is it possible for Armenians to be fully present in their present environment, New York, Washington, D.C., California, Paris, wherever it is? Or must Armenians always reserve a portion of themselves, maybe the majority of themselves, as a memorial to the place where we no longer are? The number of young Armenians who are like fourth generation here, who feel really very little attachment to Armenia. What do you do with them? Does that make them less Armenian or not? How do you approach that kind of thing? Then there's the question of, because there are a lot of differences between Armenian traditional values and the values of any other culture that they may be living in, how different actually are Armenians from other humans? Is there something, I hate to say special, is there something different about being an Armenian human, or an Eritrean human, or a Syriac human, or wherever it is that you come from? Is there something qualitatively different about that from the rest of humanity? And if so, does that make you in some way superior? That gets to be a really uncomfortable question for Armenians here. Because for many of them, yes, it does. It makes you more special. It makes you better. And your non-Armenian mate or friends inferior. They will never have the full experience. They will never really understand. All of these things become huge questions in Cilicia. And there's a related question: how different should you be? And people will come with all kinds of compromises on this. It's very fascinating to watch. People who are 150% fluent in American culture, American idiom, everything about American life. But as soon as you go to a family event, they can turn on that Armenian to exactly the same degree. It's very fascinating to watch. I don't know if that happens with Eritreans yet. It's an interesting question. How much and how much of the time should you be different? How much are you different in blood? In other words, does something awful happen to you if you marry a non-Armenian? Have you just diluted your children's heritage? And if so, why? How different should you be in faith? This is a big one for our community in America where, you know, Christianity is Christianity, right? So if you're living in a place where there's a lot of Protestants, that's what you go with. It's the same, right? Well, yes and no. So there are people who will go, no, under no circumstances. And there are people who will be like, yeah, what? And how different should you be in language? How important is language to identity? And if it's really important to identity, then how much language? Is kind of fluency in home style kitchen Armenian good enough? Or do you have to be knowledgeable in the classical language? You know, how much is, all of these things are in people's minds. And the angst when your children who have married non-Armenians don't necessarily choose to teach them or teach their children Armenian. What about when your grandkids don't speak? Or they may know enough to converse with you a little bit, but they're certainly not listening to lectures in Armenian, not with any, you know, comfort. All of these questions become very large. And they become questions also between the homeland Armenians and the Cilician Armenians. Can we negotiate? Is there a basis for negotiation between the more conservative values and religious practices of homeland Armenians? This is still true. And the less conservative, less traditional practices and values and ways of Armenians outside the homeland. And as we will see, there is a strong tendency then and now of homeland Armenians to view themselves as the guardians of the authentic Armenian tradition. And boy, did they get upset when that was challenged in the 13th century. And on the other hand, you have the Cilicians feeling that the homeland Armenians are just obtuse. They have no idea of the larger world. So they're, whereas the Cilician Armenians, you could sub in diasporan Armenians for now, are the ones who are reinventing the tradition in a live way that can interact with other cultures. So it's the question of, do we withdraw or do we engage? Is there a way to engage in a traditional manner and maintain those values? Or is it automatically compromised and you should just never step outside the ghetto? Or if you do, you come back right away. So all of this stuff is what grows out of this new Cilician situation. So we owe them a lot of our current angst on various subjects. So let me show you that as the 11th century fades into the 12th, where are the Armenians in Cilicia located? So first, in order of the importance of the place, Antioch. Big Armenian population in Antioch. This is one of the most beautiful and sophisticated cities of the ancient world. It has, in addition to the city itself on its various islands, it also has suburbs with villas and massive luxury. It was a huge center of wealth and influence. Extremely well fortified. Even today, its ramparts, such as they are very impressive.
So this is the actual Antioch?
This is actual Antioch.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can see, this is just the ruins of their ramparts. What were these things like when they were new? It's very impressive. And when excavations were done here before World War II, they found and this is not a thorough excavation, but without even trying, they found 300 mosaic floors in various luxurious buildings, ranging from ones like this, which is very simple. So it looks like it's in a little private room. Nothing fancy.
So this is underground or actually like, is it above?
Now it's above.
Okay.
Now most of these mosaics are actually in Princeton. You can go see them in their museum. To very sleek and beautiful compositions like this one. Depiction of soteria. To ones that are mind-boggling. When you look at this, you think it's painted. It's not.
Wow.
Yeah, the extraordinary quality, the patience that it takes to do something like this, the money that it took to hire somebody to put this floor in. This is a floor. Yep, in somebody's very nice salon in their house, where you would invite your guests and they could admire and be very envious of your taste and your resources. So, you know, one thinks, you know, Westerners, imperialists, they take all this stuff, they bring it to Princeton, it really doesn't belong here, but then you think, okay, if it were in Antioch, ISIS is not really fond of art, so maybe it's okay in Princeton. Antioch is also, of course, a deeply Christian city. This is one of the most ancient chalices in Christianity. It's from Antioch. It's a liturgical chalice. You can see the quality of the work. You can go down, I believe this is at the cloisters. So it's down in the Bronx. And you can see it used to be gold plated. It's actually silver. And this is the kind of thing that's being produced. Here's Christ in glory, sitting amid the vine. The ancient church of St. Peter is here. This is the place where Christians are first called Christians. The church of St. Peter is carved into the cliffs. So here it is from the inside. You see, the church has been kind of fitted into the natural formation of the rock. The altar is obviously newer. But behind the altar is the seat of Peter. It's one of the oldest churches in the world.
Yeah.
And on its floors are ancient Christian symbols. We don't necessarily think of this as an ancient Christian symbol. Nonetheless, it is. No thanks to the Nazis who co-opted it and used it for other purposes.
Yeah.
It's a cross, but it's also an eternity symbol. It's a swastika, which is what that is, the cross with the eternity symbol. So it's an extraordinary building, and it's not the only place. You can see why Armenian Christians would gravitate to this most ancient center of Christianity. But they also gravitated here to the city of Edessa, aka Urfa, now known as Sanla Urfa. And the links between Edessa and the Old Testament and Armenian Christianity in particular are very well known. This is the birthplace of Abraham in Edessa. It's a very beautiful, well-kept area. It's very proud of this Old Testament heritage, but it's also the home of King Abgar, who is the Armenians have adopted as an Armenian king, and who is the person who supposedly received from Christ a letter saying, I'm going to send you one. I couldn't come myself, but I'm going to send you one of my apostles. And by the way, here's a print of my face on a piece of fabric. Armenians were happy.
And it was so this is supposed to be Christ or the king?
That's the king.
Okay.
And Edessa is not far from Ur, the place where Abraham heard the voice of God saying, go out from your people and your country and go to the land that I shall show you. And this whole area is surrounded by ancient remains of other civilizations. For example, this is the archaeological site at Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the most ancient sets of ruins in the world. And Edessa too had mosaics in plenty, from the very simple, like this one, to the very ornate. And you can see the mixture of social classes and ethnicities in the city. It's pretty inspirational. And outside of Edessa, a fortress called Turbasel was also controlled by Armenians, who used it to assist the Crusaders in their takeover of the region. And then there are also Armenians farther to the east in a place called Raban, now it's called Araban, near Gaziantep. You can see this is in a plain. And it slides over into a town called Kesun, which is in the foothills of the Black Mountains. It was the home to a famous red monastery, we're not sure where it was, where one of the people we're going to talk about later this evening, Gregory III Pahalavuni, and his little brother Nerses, came to be near their mother's cousin, who happened to be the local prince, and be educated at that monastery. Then there's a big Armenian community here in a place called Marash. Now it's called Karamana Marash, I believe, which has its own beauty. Marashis are very proud of their background and its own antiquities. This is a feasting mosaic that was dug up there a few years ago. It has a medieval bridge that's still in use. And it has extremely plentiful water. So there's all kinds of pools and lakes and rivers in this area. Not too far away, there are also masses of Armenians in Malatya, or Militany, the place that was famous not just for its scenery, but also for its apricots. And these things are like the size of footballs. Was and is famous for its the fruit and the vegetables in its area, and its ancient tell. So this also is a city that has been there forever. It's extremely well watered in this area. It had rivers, which you can see are being used for power here. And you can still walk across a very ancient bridge there. It's still serviceable. And it has lakes. On the other side of the crescent that is Cilicia, this is modern Malatya. The side that's closest to Byzantium, Armenians were also plentiful in the north-south strip of land that ran from St. Paul's hometown here at Tarsus where the ancient gates and the ruins of the city from the time of Paul are still there. Christian pilgrimages go there. Here's part of the Roman road that actually connected Tarsus eventually to Rome. Connected Tarsus to Adana. So this is Adana, the old quarter of Adana. It's part of one of the bridges in Adana. Now it's a very Islamic city. So here's the castle at the top of Adana. Here's the view from it. It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. So you can imagine growing up in this place. This is your memories. How close do you feel to the Armenian homeland? Especially if you never get to go there. It's a very interesting question. Central to this western part of the Armenian Cilician population was the fortified castle at Lambron. Important enough, here's the area that it looks out over. Important enough that it gave its name to the people who lived there. They became the clan of the Lambronazis. They had an eagle's view of a huge area around them. And the family itself was so influential that they provided the bishops of Tarsus and Adana, which became thus kind of dependencies of Lambron. The fortress controlled the only road through the area, so it's the people who control the fortress, control passage. The road is still not that much bigger than it was. And with a good crossbow, you could pick off people on that highway. They also acquired, Armenians who didn't live in any of these places, other people's properties. This strategically very important coastal fortress built by the Byzantines, called Korikos, became an Armenian stronghold. You can see they're really, the fortress is the size of the island on which it sits. You could just dive off the wall and you're in deep water. This was the guardian of the ports of Cilicia. So while Krikor Katoigos that we spoke about last time, Gregory the Martyrophile, was attempting to find a way to be in a new Armenian diasporic reality and trying experiments like creating 8 Katoigoses in order to oversee the needs of people who were now quite widely spread out. While he was also investigating what the possibilities were for creating relationships with other churches, by going to them partly, he spent time in Constantinople, he spent time in Rome, collecting the lives of saints that were shared by all of the churches. While he was doing that, interesting things were happening in the world of secular politics. For one thing, a very ambitious prince with connections to the Bagratid dynasty. It's too bad we don't have time to talk about his life. It was wild. And he's one of the most ambitious Armenian power brokers in this region. His name is Ruben Bagratuni. And then his son Constantine and Constantine's son Toros. So the 3 successors extended their territory from the north of Cilicia, the mountain fortress called Vaca, shown here. Here's what it looks like from the other side. That's a pretty good position. They extended their land from, and it was a former Byzantine fortress. From Vaca down to another foothold that they were able to carve out for themselves in the mountains farther south called Anazarba or Anavar. It has a lot of different variations on it depending on the language of the person who's talking about it. To the seacoast. So while the fortress of Lampron really controlled the west, Ruben Bagratuni carved out for himself a kind of wall across the center of Cilicia north to south. You couldn't come and go without crossing his territory, and of course that was a good thing from his point of view. So when the crusade comes into Cilicia, it encounters Armenians who are already, at least most of them, filled with angst about who exactly they are. And in fact, the Crusaders themselves, as they settled in Cilicia and across the Middle East, faced the same situation. They're no longer European in the eyes of their European relatives. They're now exotic. They don't dress the same. I mean, Europe is a cold climate. The Middle East is a warm climate. They very quickly went native in terms of their dress and their habits. But are they really native now to the Middle East? Nobody in the Middle East thought so. So these people are liminal people. They are in the middle of two identities, neither one of which they fully inhabit. And so they're in a funny position. A generation after they have taken main cities like Antioch and Edessa, those areas become centers of very high drama. Plots, assassinations, machinations, all kinds of funky, funny business is present in these cities. And so, on the other hand, are stellar building programs, linguistic efforts, a renaissance in the arts, and a very eclectic, multilingual, very luxurious society was forming up that was partly Middle Eastern and partly Western. And so you have interesting things happening like this. The third king of Jerusalem was a Belgian crusader named Baldwin de Bourg. He served as the Count of Edessa for 18 years and then was selected, again, we could talk about this story, it's very interesting. Selected as king of Jerusalem from 1118 to 1131. He was married to an Armenian princess from Malatya, full-blooded Armenian princess, as far as we know, who was an Armenian speaker and who raised his children speaking Armenian. So they're an interesting family. He had 3 daughters with her. 4, actually. They had a very happy marriage, apparently. When he was taken captive, she actually went and found him, brought him back. Their children, their daughters, are going to sit on the thrones of all the Crusader principalities. So you have Armenian women on the throne of every major center in the Middle East. Each one of them is an unbelievable actress in an unbelievable movie. or at least a novel. Their oldest daughter, Melisande, who's shown here being crowned with her much older European husband, left marks on Jerusalem that you can still see and that show very clearly her attachment to her mother's Armenian past. And yet the general behavior and course of her life is very European. But since we don't have time for the fantastic soap opera that she was, we're going to spend our time on the equally extraordinary and very difficult life of the Catholicos who headed the Armenian church during her reign. Catholicos Krikor III Pahlavoni. This is a totally imaginary portrait of him. What strikes you about Krikor III Pahlavoni? Look at his regnal years. Those aren't the years of his life, those are the years of his reign. So when did he have to start? He had to be 15 or 20 when he started his reign. And in fact, that is the case. So the question of leadership of the Armenian church in a time period that's as transitional as this one was of huge concern to the first Catholicos of the Cilician period, Gregory the Martyrophile. An unintentional Catholicos himself, he realized that he was the person who history had selected, grace had selected, to reestablish the line of St. Gregory the Illuminator on the throne at the head of the church. And he took this responsibility very seriously. So before his own death, he secured the appointment of his nephew, one of the Catholicoses that he set up to work together with him, in the former Armenian capital city at Ani, a man named Basil, or Parser, indicating that he wanted Parser to succeed him as Catholicos in chief. That was his choice. But he also went farther than that. It's like he had some kind of prophetic insight. And he said, not only do I want the next Catholicos to be this guy, my nephew, Basil from Ani, but I also want his successor to be, so he's appointing his spiritual grandchild. I want his successor to be another one of my nephews, at that point, a very young nephew. My nephew, Grigor. There's like 20 years difference or something between the two nephews. So this is very interesting. You have a Catholicos who apparently has the force of personality to get people to agree to 2 generations of his will being carried out. As I said, he was very fixated on the importance of returning the line of Gregory the Illuminator to the headship of the church. An old-fashioned hereditary dynasty was clearly what he had in mind, although of course it wouldn't pass from father to son anymore because celibacy is now enforced for hierarchs. It would pass from uncle to nephew. And so by appointing Parser and Grigor to succeed one another, 2 generations of leadership in the line of St. Gregory were assured, and really a person can't ask for more than that. So when Gregory the Martyrophile passed away, his nephew Basil in due course came to Cilicia, established himself there, was an excellent head of the church, and died in a freak accident, quite unexpectedly. He was visiting a building that was under construction in the Catholic state. And he went up on the roof to investigate, how the progress was going. And somebody didn't see him there, and a crane came around and swept him off the roof.
Wow.
So he broke a lot of bones. He lingered for several days, long enough to make sure that people knew that he was in favor of Gregory the Martyrophile's will being carried out, even though his successor, Gregory, was only 20. He had already been a bishop, it appears, for several years. We're in a different world. And the historians are not kind to young Gregory. They call him a beardless youth, which obviously at 20 is not true for an Armenian man. But it does indicate that not everybody was on board with this vision of a new dynasty when it would bring a 20-year-old to the throne of the Armenian worldwide church. And senior bishops who had a lot more experience than he did, and who were used to the idea that the Catholicos is the senior bishop. And of course have the logical thought that the person should be experienced and have a good measure of worldly wisdom under their belt. They were not on board with this. Particularly Bishop David of Akhtamar, the Catholicosal center in the middle of Lake Van that was left there when the Armenians abandoned that kingdom. He was one of those who thought that elevating a 20-year-old to the Catholicosate was scandalous. And so a little group of bishops who shared his opinion, it's an understandable opinion, joined together to consecrate David as Catholicos instead, on the basis of not only his seniority, which was true, but also on the basis of the fact that the portable altar table and the leather belt and the staff of St. Gregory were kept on Akhtamar. Now, they didn't have his right hand, which in Armenian is a very important relic, but they also had relics of St. Hypsime, founding mother of the church. And they made the argument, Akhtamar is in Armenia. Cilicia is not in Armenia. What business does an underage Catholicos have sitting outside St. Gregory's country as St. Gregory's heir? How ridiculous is that? And so the young man, facing enough problems as it is, the first thing he has to deal with is an anti-Catholicos with good support. And the underlying question of the bid for supremacy between the physical soil of the homeland and the genetics of the illuminator, that's clearly out in the open at this point. Now, the Rupenians, we mentioned Ruben Bagratuni, are going to weigh in on this argument on the side of the new Catholicos, the young one, because it suited them as well. They are descendants of Armenia's last legitimate king. So wouldn't it be grand if you could have a situation in Armenia that has not pertained in a very long time, which is that you would have an Arshaguni style government with a Gregory Catholicos, a St. Gregory related Catholicos, working hand in hand as they had done in the days of the Illuminator. And it's kind of interesting. At this point, the Rupenian prince is named Levon. He's the fourth generation of the family in Cilicia. His wife is the sister of Baldwin de Bourg. So you can see the families are very enmeshed. So Baldwin and Leo are in-laws, they're Hanamis, and the kingdom of Jerusalem and the principality of the Rupenyans look like an alliance that might be useful. However, in this alliance, the question of the royal religion is going to arise. If your wife is Belgian and Roman Catholic, and you're Armenian and Lusavorchagan, which the family was, Rupen's family, how do you manage that with the kids?
Fight every day.
Exactly. Where are they going on Sunday?
Yeah.
So this question is going to become more and more pronounced among the Rupenyans who married almost exclusively European women. So they're actively awaiting and in anticipation of an opportunity that is going to bring them to further power, thanks to, on the one hand, their Crusader connections, and on the other hand, to their Bagratid genes. When young Krikor becomes Katoigos and enters on a lifetime of headaches, not that he hadn't had any before, we'll talk about those momentarily. But Kesun, where his seat was located, fell under the Crusaders in the very early days of his reign, and he was forced to this isn't clear enough. I was going to say this is the Rupenid family tree, and if it were clearer, you could see that pretty much everyone on it is European to some degree. So Gregory relocated the Katoigosate here to lands that had been in his family, an area called Dzovk, which just means the lake country. It fell within the kind of bigger border of the county of Edessa. Now, it's very interesting. There used to be a lot of debate about where exactly the lake country was. And there were all kinds of suggestions made, everywhere from like homeland Armenia out into Anatolia. And there were people, many scholars, who suggested that the whole story of the Pahlavuni family castle there was a myth. And then I was flying to Istanbul one summer, and in the in-flight magazine, where you never expect to see anything interesting in an in-flight magazine, the Turkish Airlines in-flight magazine broke the story of a lake whose water level had gone down thanks to seismic activity, exposing a castle in the right place and from the right time. The causeway that used to lead from the shore to the castle was gone, but the castle's presence is really clear. And the water level didn't drop far enough to expose all of it. So Turkish divers, archaeological underwater people, had explored what remained below the surface, and they too came to the conclusion that this was the Pahlavuni family castle.
This was mentioned in the article in the
Yes,
magazine?
yes, I was totally surprised. And Gregory III and Nerses IV's father died on this wall. It was a very freaky happening too. Freaky happenings ran in this family. There was a Turkish attack against the castle. Gregory's father was in charge of the castle. He repelled the invaders. The success, he won. And as he leaned over the edge of the wall in order to view what had happened, a Turkish soldier who was lying on the ground wounded shot him. Just sat up enough to shoot him. And he fell from the wall. And not only did he fall from the wall, but he was holding on to a sculpture that was on the wall, and that fell, and that's what actually killed him. So totally, this should never have happened. And it was a tragedy for the family. He had 5 children or 6 children. His wife couldn't maintain a military post like that, and she was dispossessed and had to leave with her kids. Which is how young Gregory ended up in school in Kessun when he was about 8, taking care of his baby brother, who was also placed at the same school. So moving the Katolikosate from Zopk, from the Lake Country, or to the Lake Country, was a major undertaking. It's not that far in terms of distance, but imagine you're moving a school, you're moving a bureaucracy, you're moving a library, you're moving all kinds of offices, you have to relocate people as well, your staff is going with you. It's an incredible task. And fortunately, young Grigor didn't know that he was going to have to do it again in 1150. But between the move, the political situation, the opposition of senior bishops to him, and the basic administrative duties that he faced, he needed a coadjutor Catholicos, somebody who would work with him on a daily basis. And for that position, it's like he was like, I can't get any worse. So for that position, he appointed his little brother, named Nerses. We don't know if that's his birth name or the name he took when he was ordained. He was a priest by the time he was 15. He was about 17 when he was charged with this move. And like his brother, he was probably a bishop by the time he was 20 or 21. And he was the perfect coadjutor. He was his brother's right-hand man until Gregory died in 1166. They cooperated for like half a century together. As you could see, he will be Catholicos himself, but for a very brief time. One of the most difficult conundrums that they faced, the two brothers, was how to gain support in the region. Armenians at that moment are still a very scattered population, although there are big centers of them. The church is also very aware of the encroachments of Islam in the area, so they're not going to be able to get support for things Armenian from Muslims. They're not going to be able to get that from Byzantines either at that moment. So who does that leave as your potential allies in the region? It really leaves the Crusaders. It leaves the Roman Catholics. And so in 1141, when a Roman Catholic synod, disciplinary synod, convened in Antioch, the Roman Catholics, who are also looking at the area and saying, okay, where are the Crusaders going to get support from? They've already identified the Armenians. They invite both Krikor and Nerses to come to this disciplinary synod. And for them, it's like this is a door of grace. This is their golden opportunity to hobnob and get to know Latins, as they were called, at the highest level. Because it seemed to them that the papacy had very formidable strength in Europe. This was not actually totally true, but it was from time to time. And they knew that there had been recent reforms in the Roman Catholic hierarchy that made it more appealing ethically to conservatives like Armenians. And in addition, the Armenians had some leverage in Rome because one of the Rupenian princes had been very helpful to Roman Catholics in Antioch. So in a way, the Crusaders owed the Armenians a favor. Now, if they had had some kind of a crystal ball to see 50 years or 100 years down the road, they might have made a different decision. But as it was, they were very excited about this opportunity to get closer to the Roman Catholics. And they didn't have a lot of other options. One of the things that they couldn't foresee coming down the road was the effect that there would be on Roman mentality from a new claim that the papacy was beginning to make to be the supreme head of Christianity worldwide. This is something new. It was a very handy weapon in the polemical arsenal of popes as they struggled with Byzantine emperors, trying to get superiority. And it sounded good. You know, Rome is the ancient place. Peter and Paul died there, and the Bishop of Rome has always been accorded extraordinary prestige. But at this moment in time, Roman thinkers were still a little unclear about how to make this claim to worldwide supremacy. Is Rome supreme because of St. Peter? Well, probably that's not the best argument to make because he was in Antioch first. Was it because it had been head of the ancient empire? Then Constantinople could say, well, we're the head of the present empire. Is it because Rome has both of those things? What's going on here? So the Romans are just beginning to formulate arguments for why the Pope should have the ultimate say in all church matters. And in 100 years, that's going to segue into Rome's perceived right on its own perception to legislate to other churches what they should be doing. And there are going to be all kinds of issues that will later arise from that, but nobody could see that coming down the highway. And it took the Eastern churches quite a long while to understand the implications of what they were hearing about Rome as the supreme. Because in the East, there was nobody who denied the primacy of Peter. Later, a lot of people tried to backtrack and say, no, no, no. But it's very clear in the literature. Christ had clearly favored him. The early church had clearly favored him. It was a principle of the Pentarchy that no decision could be made without Peter's representative. So he was clearly important. But anyway, we'll come back to that in another couple of classes. So at the Council of Antioch in 1140, Catholicos Grigor was invited to sit on the throne of Peter during the deliberations. That is a very high honor, as you can imagine. And then from Antioch, he was invited to go to Jerusalem for another synod, and he took that opportunity while he sent Nerses home to do the day-to-day stuff. So there's this kind of new courtship dance going on between the Roman Catholics and the Armenian hierarchy. And as always happens, as you're getting to know a new jurisdiction of your faith, there's going to be a new need to explain yourself because Armenians are not quite like others when it comes to some of the things they do. And so the Byzantines and the Armenians in this time period are both thinking, okay, this is going to take some concerted effort on our part to explain ourselves to the Roman Catholics in terms they can understand. Is it going to be worth it? Is it worth the effort? Ultimately, they will decide yes. Partly because this is the head of the Byzantine Empire at the time. Manuel I Comnenus was a man who envisioned peace. Peace with all his neighbors. And he had this grand vision. This is an age when people have these grand visions. You have a grand vision of restoring an Arshaguni and a Pahlavuni dynasty in Armenia. He has a vision, Manuel has a vision of a united Europe that would be a bigger, a greater Roman/Byzantine Empire, and a church to go with it. So he's very invested in dialogue with Roman Catholics, with Armenians, with Syriacs, anybody he can get his hands on. He wanted a union between Byzantium and Rome. He wanted a union between Byzantium and the Armenians, because after all, he felt Armenians are not that bad. You know, they're not that far from the truth, except they have some weird kind of Jewish customs that they do, like unleavened bread, like fasting on Saturdays. Oh, that's interesting. Armenians don't do that anymore. Like the extra long fast that they have for Lent. You know, those things are a little weird, but there's nothing wrong with them, he thought. And then there's that little question about Chalcedon, but that was a long time ago, so who really cares? He said it's just odd that Armenians, even though their teaching doesn't contravene Chalcedon in any way, they have this bee in their bonnet about accepting it or not accepting it. So, okay, fine. It probably also helped that the patriarch at the time was an Armenian ethnically. So, the Armenian Catholicosate finds itself now faced with multiple tracks of ecumenical dialogue that it has to carry on. They're engaged with the Latins, they're engaged with the Byzantines. And funnily, they were kind of triangulated because they also found themselves having to defend themselves to the Roman Catholics against accusations that were made about them to the Roman Catholics by the Byzantines. And it just got messy. You know, the Byzantines told us this about you. What do you say about that? So they decided to cut to the chase and sent a delegation to Viterbe in Italy, where the Pope was hanging out. 11, this is the papal palace there. It's quite nice. Pretty impressive. And this is the Pope, Eugenius III. So this delegation wanted to do two things. On the one hand, it wanted to counter accusations that were being made about Armenians to the Roman Catholics. And then it also wanted to ask the Pope's advice on a very strange issue that they were having difficulty with, which was the baptizing of infants of non-Christians. So how do we handle that? Muslims are coming to us and saying, we want to baptize our kids. We don't want to cause, you know, turmoil in the neighborhood, but this is really weird and we don't see why they want it. So what do you advise us to do? How do we handle this? So it's interesting. Along the way, as they're getting towards Italy, they made some stops, do some business. They heard that the city of Edessa had been retaken by the Muslims from its half Armenian prince. And this is going to launch a new crusade. I don't know if you're familiar with this man's face, but Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was the most galvanizing and charismatic speaker in Europe at the time. He inflamed European Christians with the desire to regain Edessa for Christ. And funnily enough, Saint Bernard was a very big fan of a saint named Ambrosian, who was Armenian, and the center of whose cult was in Bernard's hometown, Fontaine-le-Dijon, in Burgundy. Of all the weird things, you know, what in the world is an Armenian being venerated in France for? But anyway, the Armenians coming back from Viterbe to deal with this new question in Edessa were filled with enthusiasm for what they'd seen at Viterbe, you know, the might, the luxury, the power of Rome. And they reported on this, their impressions, to Gregory and to Nerses. Unfortunately, Edessa was never recovered, never became a Christian city again. But its princess, Beatrice, once her rather useless husband had died, sold to Catholicos Grigor this, her fortress, at a place called Hăromkla, which just means the Byzantine castle, smack in the middle of the river Euphrates. And so the Catholicosate moved again. After 30 years, a little bit more, in the Lake Country. And this time it's a bit of a different deal because the Catholicos is nearing 60 at this point. Nerses is 50. And there's a lot of work to be done to retrofit this castle as a fully functioning patriarchate with a school, a scriptorium, charitable outreach institutions, several churches, and so on. This is in the 1150. But among all of their new busyness in resettling themselves here on the Euphrates, you can see on the one hand, it's very beautiful. On the other hand, it's pretty isolated. And later, Nerses will describe this as a prison. So I'm imprisoned on a big rock. It's a fantastic location. Now it's a big tourist site. If you go to Turkey, you can go here. You can see how the fortification just kind of fades down into the rock itself, and some of it is excavated into the rock. Even though they're very busy with all of the changes that had to happen here, plus the transportation nightmare of getting stuff located here, they tended to one important family obligation. In fact, they're going to tend to several. Just in the same way that their cousins, Catholicos Parser and before him Vagayaser, had spent time and effort preparing the two of them, they took in their brother's son, whose father had died, and raised him for a career in the church. His name is also Krikor, so you have to do something when you've got two Krikors in the same building. And to differentiate him from the Catholicos, he became known as Krikor Dara, Gregory the Lad. And he remained Gregory the Lad into his old age. It just kind of stuck. And he'll be a very interesting character when we get to him. So once the Catholicosate had moved to the fort, to Hăromkla, Nerses would get the secondary name of Nerses Galaetsi, Nerses of the castle. People didn't call him Nerses Shnorhali, which is the name that he's known by now. It means Nerses full of grace. And so people often think that Nerses full of grace is a comment on his character, which was indeed, in his later years at least, very gracious. But actually, it was the graduation title given to students from the school that he and his brother had attended who were outstanding in some way. And so there are actually 4 Shnorhalis, 4 people with this title who graduated from that school. So it's not a comment on his character. He was known at the time by the place that he was serving. And it was a very stressful time. And so not surprisingly, Nerses became exceedingly ill. There's also a big change in climate. The Euphrates River is not like the healthiest place to be. He became so ill that he nearly died. And when he finally got his health back about a year later, he was a changed man, and he says so in his own writing. He said it totally transformed the way that he existed in the world, because he finally realized that he was playing around in his life. He had taken advantage of his brother's willingness to shoulder the vast majority of the responsibility for the burdens of a Catholicosate, while he spent a lot of his time writing and composing poetry and music. And his older brother had indulged him in this because he knew he was very talented. And he had kind of taken advantage of that and left his brother to carry all the hard stuff. And he looked at his brother, realized finally that his brother is aging, and said, no, I have to really carry my end of things. And so he began taking on more burdensome duties and writing less. And one of the burdensome duties that he took on for his brother was a family problem. So it was around 1164. There was a huge problem among related princes. They were all related to the Catholicos family, but they were also related to the Lampron family. And so there was a feud that developed between two of the men in the family. Nerses was chose himself, actually, because he didn't want his brother having to deal with it, to go and mediate and try to see if they couldn't get this argument settled before it ripped the power structure of the rising principalities apart. And so he goes to Lampron, which is the center of the contention, and has meetings with both men. And while he's hanging out, his sister is married to one of them. While he's hanging out there, they give a dinner in his honor, and he's sitting in the whatever kind of meeting area before the dinner starts. And they bring in a young kid. Come and meet your uncle Nerses. The kid's about 11, maybe a little younger. And he comes into the room, and he writes about this later. He says, I see this old dude sitting across the room. That's your uncle Nerses. And he's like, yeah, whatever. His own name at the time was Sumbat. So he wasn't impressed with his great uncle, but the uncle was impressed with him. The uncle saw something in that kid, and he said to his sister, you're going to give me that one. That one is for the church. And as we'll see, he turns out to be another very precocious churchman. And his story, we'll get to it. It's on the wild side. So they have this long negotiation. It's drawn out. It's difficult. It's stressful. In the end, it works. It's going to work for a little while anyway. Nerses is like, oh, that really took it out of me. I'm not the young man I used to be. And so when his sister says, hey, you're here, would you like to go down to the seacoast? We have a place in Mamestia. You can spend some nice time down there, rest, relax. He's like, yeah, okay. I deserve it. Who knows if I'll ever get out of Hromkla again. I'm going to take advantage of it. And it just so happened that in Mamestia, where he was hanging out, the Byzantine emperor's deputy was also in town. The Byzantine emperor's deputy and son-in-law. And when the young Alexius heard that a senior Armenian prelate was in town, he's like, ooh, wonder if he'd like to have coffee, or whatever the equivalent is at the time. I have lots of questions about the Armenian stuff, and I bet he can tell me. So they got together. And Alexius asked Nerses to explain to him the reason for the division in the one Church of Christ. Light dinner conversation. And so their conversation turned into several days of debate, discussion, probing one another's ways of doing things. And we don't know how long after this conversation really got Nerses thinking about the possibilities of really dialoguing with Byzantines. And so he continued to hang out for a while in the area, thinking about this, as well as, of course, enjoying the ocean view. And finally, when he goes back to Haromkala, after being away for like a year, he sees that his brother Gregory has aged tremendously. And he realizes that his brother, in order for him to be able to continue to enjoy his time outside, has not sent him any messages saying, I'm really sick and I need you. And he very quickly recognized, and was clear about this with him, that Gregory could no longer function, could no longer fulfill his duties as Katolikos. And so Krikor is like, I'm glad you had a good time away. Wanted you to have a good time away. Now you got to step up. And Nerses had always resisted his brother's invitations to become coadjutor Katolikos because he liked staying in the background, having his brother at the front. He said, this time it's different. Gregory says, this is not a suggestion. This is not an invitation. This is going to happen. I am going to die, and it's sooner than later. We can't have a succession battle when I'm gone. It's not the time. And so Gregory mustered his remaining strength to have a synod of bishops, vartabeds, and all the monastics, as we're told by one historian, to approve Nerses's consecration as coadjutor Katolikos, and Gregory had the bittersweet pleasure of performing his consecration. April 17th, Palm Sunday, 1166. And Nerses would serve as coadjutor for simply 3 months. The Haismabur tells us, the readings for the day tells us that Gregory died on August 8th, 1166. And Nerses is devastated. He buried his brother, calls him his brother in the flesh, but his father in the spirit, buried him next to the church that Gregory had built in Haromkala. And so after they have spent 60-something years together, Nerses was left alone with the responsibilities of office. He was alone spiritually. He felt very alone administratively. He had no idea who he could call on as a coadjutor Katolikos. And he began to realize how much his brother had spared him from the actual burdens of running a church. And when he writes about his brother, he's He remembers him as pure in soul, wise in word, in study, in knowledge, and most of all, astute in counsel. And he missed his brother's excellent advice. And we know from the hymns that have come down to us under Gregory's name that he would, in his own right, have been a wonderful writer if he had not chosen to give all of that opportunity to Nerses. He was, a historian says, gloriously respected, not only by our own people, but also by foreign kings and princes, especially the kings and patriarchs of the Romans, who together with his impressive and handsome physical appearance recognized the beauty of his soul and the truth in his declaration of faith. So there Nerses is, in the grip of old age himself, bereaved, with a waning reserve of energy to meet all these new challenges that are coming to him. And he wondered what he would be remembered for. He remembered that by rights, he's the one who should have died first, 15 years earlier, when he had that illness. He should have just stepped on through to the other side, because he had lived a worthless life in his own estimation. Now, never mind that by that time, Grigor de Ra, Gregory the lad, is 40 years old and is his right hand. But there was nothing that would replace his brother. He also ordained excellent bishops. And he did what he could in those 7 years when he no longer had leisure to write because he was administrating all the time. Most of his writing career was behind him. He wrote masses of poetry, hymns that we still use, and so on and so forth. He's probably the most prolific of Armenian writers. His hymns are so beloved today, most people know them by heart, or at least a section of them by heart. Thousands of lines of poetry. One of the most famous things that he wrote is after his brother's death, he wrote a general epistle to all of the Armenian bishops and churches in order to inform them of his brother's death and in order to give pastoral advice to them, because he knew that he would not, certainly at his present age, be traveling to see people. And we'll look at this letter later. It lays out the obligations of each social class of people. In other words, the amount of damage that they're not fulfilling their Christian responsibility could do to society. It's very interesting. Meanwhile, ironically, he received a letter from Manuel, who did not know that Gregory had died, and who said that he was totally delighted with a letter that Nerses had written at the request of Alexios to lay out the Armenian faith in a way that Byzantines would understand. And Manuel says, I would love to, he's writing to Gregory, who he doesn't know is dead, please send your brother Nerses. We would love to host him in Byzantium and have talks. I'm very sanguine about the opportunity that we may have for creating unity in the church. And Nerses got to write to him and say, I would love to come, but I can't right now. This is the situation. Meanwhile, Nerses was facing enormous opposition. People who had not liked his brother didn't like him either. And we have letters from him to various people who wrote against him or who worked against him. They're very interesting letters. There's one guy who has just rips the Catholicos up and down for all kinds of things. And the Catholicos' response is, thank you for your letter. You don't know the half of my sins. It's so much worse than you could even imagine. I think you should come and we should have tea and we should discuss. And that's it. Come and see me. I'd love to have you here. I'd love to host you. I'd love to hear more of what's bothering you. And please be assured, I'm much worse than you can possibly imagine. Whatever you've heard is nothing like the truth. It's an interesting attitude to take. We also know that he was very involved in charitable work in the area around him in a very beautiful way. He would send out his deacons and other young guys to have a beer in the local pub and keep their ear to the ground and see, is there anybody in the community who's having a hard time that might be embarrassed to like come to the Católico? Say there was a regular every Friday or something. They gave out food and clothing and money to people who needed. Is there anybody in the villages who would be embarrassed to come, but who does have need? And if they heard of something, they would report back to him, and he would see to it that money made it to those people without their knowing where it came from. So he was a genuinely charitable person. And on one day of the week too, he would have lunch or dinner, whatever he was eating, in company with anybody who came. Open table with the Católicos. And if there were particularly nice things for lunch, he would carry the trays around and make sure that everybody got something nice. Here, this looks good. Have some. And yet, this was a man who died thinking he had had a totally ineffective life. And throughout all of this period, he and Gregory were very involved in this ecumenical dialogue that they had had a chance to start with the Roman Catholics in 1140. And so next time and the time after, we're going to look at writing on this and on other topics that were occupying people's minds in this time when the populations of Armenians are beginning to settle down into Cilician life, when they're beginning to start to feel at home. What are people thinking about, writing about, talking about? So the next two classes will be discussing different authors, some of them in Cilicia, some of them in the homeland, and we'll be seeing, what goes on in this liminal period, what's occupying people's minds.